fine. I've already called someone to help.
A 21-year-old woman disappears in less than 10 minutes. No footprints, no struggle, no sound. On the night of February 9th, 2004, Maura Murray crashes her car on a quiet stretch of Route 112 in New Hampshire. It's freezing. Snow is falling. The road is nearly empty. A passing school bus driver stops and speaks with her. She looks shaken, but calm. She tells him she's already called for help. She refuses his offer.
I'm fine. I've already called someone to help.
10 minutes later, police arrive. The car is locked. The engine is off. Her phone is still inside. And Maura is gone. No tracks leading into the woods. No signs of a struggle. Nothing to suggest where she went, or how she disappeared so quickly in the freezing dark. At first it seemed simple. Maybe she wandered off. Maybe she panicked. But the more investigators looked into Maura's life, the more this case began to unravel. She had lied to her professors just days before. She packed almost nothing. She drove north without telling anyone where she was going. And then, inside her abandoned car, there was one detail that didn't belong. A detail that would raise a much darker question. Was Maura running from something that night? Or did something already know where to find her? Because some disappearances don't end with a body. They end with a question that crawls inside your mind and never leaves. What really happened in those 10 minutes, when Maura Murray stepped into the snow and was never seen again? Maura Murray was 21, sharp-witted and full of quiet fire. She had the kind of smile that lit up a room. Dimples deep, eyes bright with that mix of determination and mischief her sister Julie always teased her about. Growing up in a loud, competitive household in Hanson, Massachusetts, Maura learned early how to hold her own. She ran track like her life depended on it, wrote thank-you notes for no reason at all, and dreamed of helping people as a nurse. At UMass Amherst, her days had a steady rhythm. Morning classes in nursing, afternoons buried in textbooks or out running the trails around campus. She was the girl who remembered birthdays, who laughed easily with friends, who pushed herself hard even when things felt heavy. Life looked normal, busy, ordinary, but beneath the surface small cracks had started to show. She had left West Point behind after just a few semesters. The rigid military life no longer fit the girl who wanted something softer, more human. She carried that decision quietly, like a secret weight. And then there were the people who drifted through her world. One of them had once stood beside her during a difficult moment at the academy. A fellow cadet, someone who listened when she needed an advocate, someone whose name would surface years later on a cold CD case inside her abandoned car. Back then, no one thought twice about it. Maura's family was tight in that loud, protective way. Her siblings, Julie, Kathleen, Fred Jr., and little Curtis, watched out for one another the way military kids often do. Their parents had split when Maura was small, but the Murray kids stuck together, ribbing each other, cheering each other on. Julie still remembers how Maura would fire back with quick, clever comebacks whenever her older siblings tried to tease her. She was the jokester, the thoughtful one, the helper. On the surface, February 9th, 2004 began like any other winter day. Classes, emails, a quick stop at the ATM. A bag packed lighter than it should have been. Nothing screamed danger. Nothing screamed goodbye. Yet that morning, Maura sent a short message to her professors. Death in the family. She needed to go home. There was no death. No one in her family had any idea she was leaving campus. She simply got in her old black Saturn, pointed it north toward the White Mountains, and drove into the falling snow. She was an excellent runner, someone who knew how to move through tough terrain. She loved the trails in those mountains, but she wasn't dressed for a long hike in freezing conditions. She didn't tell a single friend her plans. And somewhere along that empty stretch of Route 112, the ordinary day shattered. The car left the road, the snow kept falling, and Maura stepped out into the cold, carrying secrets no one fully understood. Even now, her sister's voice still echoes with the same quiet ache. We've waited long enough. Because the girl who wrote thank-you notes and dreamed of saving lives didn't just vanish into thin air, something, or someone, made sure she never came back. The cracks started small. February 9th, 2004. Maura Murray had been up late the night before, searching for places to stay in the White Mountains. She emailed her homework in at 3:32 a.m., the responsible student still checking boxes, but by afternoon the mask slipped. She told her professors there was a death in the family. There wasn't. She packed light. Too light for February in New Hampshire. She withdrew almost every dollar she had from an ATM and $280 waste alone, caught on camera. Then she stopped for alcohol, a lot of it. Friends later said she seemed distracted, emotional, carrying something heavy she wouldn't name. Those small lies, those quiet decisions. They usually mean nothing until the day everything goes wrong. And that day was coming fast. Around 3:30 p.m., Maura climbed into her black Saturn and pointed north. No one knew, not her family, not her boyfriend, stationed out of state. She drove for hours through growing snow, the wipers fighting the storm. She had crashed her father's car just days earlier, another accident she tried to hide. Now she was driving again, fast, alone, into the dark. By 7:27 p.m., the road had narrowed. Route 112, Wild Ammonosuc Road, Haverhill, New Hampshire. Remote. Trees pressing close, snow falling harder. The Saturn lost control. It slid, spun, and slammed into a snowbank. Windshield cracked. Airbags exploded with a dull thud. The engine died. For a moment, silence. Except the wind. A local resident, Faith Westman, heard the impact and called 911 at 7:27. She saw a figure standing near the car. Then Butch Atwood, the school bus driver, rolled up in his big yellow bus just minutes later. He stopped, opened the door. Maura stood there, shaken but composed. No visible blood. She told him she was fine. She had already called for help. She didn't want him to call the police. She just needed a tow. Butch offered anyway. She refused again. Calm, insistent. He drove the short distance home, parked, and called 911 himself at 7:42. Police were dispatched immediately. It should have taken them only a few minutes to reach the scene. When Sergeant Cecil Smith arrived at 7:46, barely 10 minutes after the first call, the car was locked from the inside, engine off. Maura Murray was gone, no footprints leading clearly into the woods. The fresh snow had already started to cover any trace. Her black backpack, the one she always carried, was missing. Inside the car, scattered clothes, school books, makeup, gloves, her AAA card, and an open box of wine. No blood, no signs of a violent struggle. Just an abandoned vehicle on a freezing, empty road, and a young woman who had vanished into thin air in under 15 minutes. Here's what makes your skin crawl. She told Butch she had called for help. She hadn't. She refused assistance from the only person who stopped. She stepped out of that car and chose the dark. Or someone chose it for her. Because in that narrow window between Butch driving away and police pulling up, something happened. A window so small it feels impossible, yet Maura disappeared inside it. The search began that night. Dogs, flashlights, officers calling her name into the freezing woods. Nothing. No scream, no cry for help. Just the snow falling silently, covering everything. And the growing sense that this wasn't a simple accident. This was the moment the ordinary day turned into something much darker. Something that has stayed hidden for 22 years. Because the girl who walked away from that car never walked back. And whatever waited for her in the cold that night is still waiting for answers. The snow was still falling heavily when Sergeant Cecil Smith arrived at 7:46 p.m. Just minutes after Butch Atwood's 911 call. Headlights cut through the darkness. Blue lights flashed against the thick woods. The black Saturn sat silent on the side of Route 112, engine cold, airbags deflated. The car was locked. Maura Murray was nowhere to be seen. Inside, investigators found red stains from spilled wine, not blood, scattered clothes, textbooks, makeup, and an open box of wine. Her black backpack was missing, along with her phone and wallet. A rag had been stuffed into the tailpipe, but there were no obvious signs of a violent struggle. What struck everyone immediately was how little evidence remained. Fresh snow had already begun covering the ground. A tracking dog later used one of Maura's gloves and picked up her scent, following it roughly 100 yards east along the road before losing it completely in the middle of the pavement. Some interpreted this as a possible sign she had gotten into another vehicle. That first night, the search was limited. Officers and volunteers used flashlights and vehicles to check the immediate area, but the heavy snow, freezing temperatures, well below zero with wind chill, and darkness made a full-ground search extremely difficult. No extensive foot search into the deep woods happened until daylight. The next morning, February 10th and 11th, a much larger effort began. New Hampshire Fish and Game, local police, volunteers, and Maura's family joined in. Tracking dogs, cadaver dogs, and even a helicopter with thermal imaging were brought in over the following days and weeks. They scoured the roadsides, trails, and wooded areas within several miles of the crash site. Despite the intensity, they found no clothing, no footprints that could be clearly linked to Maura, and no trace of her body. Years later, additional searches continued, including private efforts by the family using cadaver dogs that alerted in certain locations, such as an old A-frame house about a mile away. But nothing conclusive was ever recovered. As the investigation expanded, three main theories emerged among police, the family, and the public. First, Maura simply walked away on her own, perhaps intending to disappear or escape personal stress, and succumbed to the brutal cold. She was an experienced runner and knew mountainous terrain, but she wasn't dressed for a long trek in sub-zero conditions with alcohol in her system. Hypothermia could have set in fast, and her body might still be lying in an area that was never fully searched. Second, she accepted a ride from a passing motorist in that narrow window after Butch Atwood left. In a remote area on a snowy night, a good Samaritan could have stopped. This theory ranges from an innocent ride that went wrong to foul play, someone who took advantage of a vulnerable young woman. Third, the possibility of a planned runaway that went wrong. Maura had lied about a death in the family, withdrawn nearly all her money, and packed lightly. Some believe she wanted a fresh start, but something, an accident, exposure, or an encounter, prevented her from reaching safety. Her family pushed aggressively for more resources. Her father, Fred Murray, repeatedly questioned why the initial search didn't go farther east, the direction the tracking dog had briefly followed. Her sister Julie still asks the same painful question today. Why wasn't the area covered more thoroughly that very first night? Over the next 22 years, the case never fully went cold. Tips continued to come in. Investigators revisited old evidence with new technology. The New Hampshire Cold Case Unit now uses LiDAR scans to detect ground disturbances and facial recognition tools in hopes of generating fresh leads. The $40,000 reward remains active. Yet despite all of this, dogs, helicopters, volunteers, modern tech, there is still no body, no confirmed trail, and no definitive answer. That's what makes Maura's disappearance so deeply unsettling. In most missing persons cases, something eventually breaks the silence. A mistake, a witness, a piece of physical evidence. Here, the silence has held for over 2 decades. A 10 to 15-minute window, a locked car on a snowy road, a young woman who stepped into the freezing dark and simply vanished. The White Mountains are still holding their secret. But the questions refuse to die. Did Maura walk into those woods and never make it out? Did someone stop and offer her a ride she shouldn't have taken? Or did whatever happened that night begin long before she ever reached Route 112? 22 years later, Maura Murray's case still has no body, no charges, and no trial. There has never been a courtroom verdict that could bring her home. However, one development in recent years brought renewed attention to a name from Maura's past. Stephen Baldwin, formerly known as Stephen Finkelstein, was a cadet at West Point around the same time as Maura. He had once served as her student advocate during a disciplinary matter at the academy. Years later, investigators matched his fingerprint to an item, a CD or CD case, found inside Maura's abandoned Saturn. Importantly, there is no evidence linking Baldwin to Maura's disappearance or to the events on Route 112 that night. He has consistently denied any involvement, stating that the fingerprint was from years earlier when they knew each other at West Point. In a separate case in Ohio, Baldwin faced serious charges unrelated to Maura. In January 2025, he stood trial in Union County on multiple felony counts including animal cruelty, grand theft, fraud, and other offenses connected to his work at animal shelters. He was found guilty on most counts and on March 18, 2025, was sentenced to 15.5 years in prison. For Maura's family, this development brought no closure. Her sister Julie still returns to the crash site every year on February 9th, lighting candles alongside her siblings. With a voice steady but heavy with exhaustion, she continues to say, "We've waited long enough. If you know something, please speak now." The family has been vocal in pushing for greater transparency. They support the creation of a formal cold case commission in New Hampshire, so families can stay better informed about ongoing investigations. Her brother Curtis has spoken about the passage of time. He has now lived more of his life without Maura than with her. The absence doesn't disappear. It simply becomes part of the shape of every day. The mountains of New Hampshire remain quiet. The New Hampshire State Police Cold Case Unit continues to work the case using newer technology such as LiDAR scanning and fresh analysis of existing evidence. Tips still come in. The $40,000 reward for information leading to Maura's whereabouts is still active, but as of 2026, Maura has not been found. Baldwin remains incarcerated in Ohio for his unrelated convictions. His DNA is now on file, and investigators have followed up on the fingerprint lead. Yet the case itself stays open and unsolved. A single fingerprint from decades ago brought a name back into the spotlight, but it has not answered the central question. Maura was 21 years old. She dreamed of becoming a nurse and helping others. She was a dedicated runner with a sharp mind and a kind heart. Somewhere on that cold stretch of Route 112 in February 2004, her story took a turn that still doesn't add up. The White Mountains continue to hold their silence. Her family, and everyone who has followed this case, keeps hoping that one day the truth will surface. Not through speculation, but through solid evidence and answers. Because some disappearances don't end with a dramatic verdict. They end with quiet persistence. Families who refuse to stop asking, investigators who keep working, and a community that still remembers a young woman who vanished in the snow. Maura's story is not over, and the question remains the same after more than 20 years. What really happened to Maura Murray on the night of February 9th, 2004? Some people don't snap, they calculate. They wear the mask so well that even they start to believe it, but in a case like this, we have to be careful. Because psychology doesn't prove what happened, it only helps us understand what might be possible. Over the years, people have looked at different individuals connected to Maura's life, trying to understand whether any of those connections could explain what happened that night. One name that has surfaced in discussions is Stephen Baldwin, once Stephen Finkelstein. At West Point, he was known as a helpful cadet, the one who stepped up as Maura's student advocate during her disciplinary hearing. He listened. He supported her. He positioned himself as someone she could trust during a difficult time. At the time, it didn't seem unusual, but years later, that connection has raised questions. What we know about his later life adds another layer to those questions. He built a public persona around helping animals. He's a dog whisperer, someone who presented himself as a rescuer. Behind that image, authorities later accused him of fraud, deception, and serious misconduct involving animals, a pattern that, at the very least, suggests someone capable of manipulation, of controlling how others see him. Psychologists often describe certain behavioral patterns using what's called the dark triad, traits like narcissism, Machiavellian thinking, and lack of empathy. But having those traits doesn't prove involvement in any crime. It simply highlights a type of personality that can appear trustworthy on the surface, while hiding something more complicated underneath. And that raises a difficult question. If Maura had encountered someone familiar that night, someone she recognized, would she have reacted differently? Would she have lowered her guard, even for a moment? Because familiarity changes everything. It softens instinct, it delays fear. It makes a dangerous situation feel just safe enough. At the same time, there's another possibility that doesn't involve anyone else at all. Maura was under pressure. She had left West Point. She had recently crashed her father's car. She was dealing with stress, expectations, and the weight of her own decisions. That day she lied about a death in the family, packed lightly, and drove north alone. For some, that looks like a planned escape. For others, it looks like someone overwhelmed, trying to get away. So, which is it? Did she encounter someone that night? Or was everything that happened the result of choices she made on her own? The truth is, we don't know. What makes this case so unsettling isn't just the mystery of the crash or the absence of evidence. It's how many different explanations can exist at the same time, and how none of them fully explain what happened. If someone else was involved, why is there no clear sign of a struggle? If she left on her own, How did she vanish so completely in freezing conditions? And if there was an interaction in those final minutes, was it driven by fear, trust, or something in between? The scariest part of cases like this isn't always the idea of a stranger in the dark. Sometimes it's the possibility that danger doesn't look dangerous at all, that it speaks calmly, offers help, feels familiar. Maura Murray was 21. She wanted to help people. She pushed herself hard. She carried more than most people could see. And somewhere along that quiet stretch of Route 112, something happened in a matter of minutes that no one has been able to fully explain, whether it involved another person or something happening entirely within her own decisions. Remains unanswered. Because in the end, this case doesn't give us certainty. It gives us possibilities, and forces us to sit with a question that still hasn't gone away after all these years. What really happened to Maura Murray in those final 10 minutes on that road? Let's go back for one moment to that black Saturn sitting quietly on the side of Route 112, doors locked from the inside, engine off, airbags deployed like pale ghosts in the dashboard, and the one detail almost everyone accepted without question. Maura told Butch Atwood she had already called for help. She hadn't. We've always assumed that was a lie. A quick, nervous excuse from a young woman who wanted to be left alone. But what if it wasn't that simple? What if, in those chaotic minutes after the crash, she believed help was coming? For a reason. Not because she had called anyone, but because she thought someone already knew where she was. It's only a possibility. But it changes how you look at everything that followed. Because the most unsettling part of this case is how little disruption there was. No blood, no scream, no clear sign of a struggle, just a locked car on a snowy road, and a young woman who refused help from the only person who stopped. Was that choice driven by fear or by trust? Because those two things can look very similar in the wrong moment, and that's where the case becomes deeply uncomfortable, not because we know what happened, but because we don't. Some believe she left on her own. Others believe she encountered someone on that road, and some have looked at people from her past, trying to understand whether any connection could explain what happened. None of those paths have led to a clear answer, and maybe that's the real twist, not that Maura disappeared, but that everything about her disappearance can be explained in completely different ways, depending on what you believe, because the scariest cases aren't the ones with obvious violence. They're the ones with silence, the ones where nothing clearly goes wrong, and yet everything does. Silence lets us fill in the blanks with whatever feels safest. She ran away. She got lost. She started over somewhere else. Because the alternative is harder to sit with, that something happened in those final minutes, and it left almost no trace behind. This case forces a difficult question, not about Maura, but about us. How much do we rely on familiarity? How quickly do we trust someone who seems calm, helpful, normal? Because sometimes the most dangerous situations don't feel dangerous at all. Maura Murray stepped out of that car 22 years ago, and whatever happened next still hasn't been proven. The mountains are still quiet, the answers are still missing, and the question remains not just what happened to Maura, but how something could happen so quickly and leave so little behind. If you've made it this far, then you already know. This case doesn't give easy answers, so now I want to hear from you. What do you think really happened that night on Route 112? Do you believe Maura walked away on her own? Or did someone else enter that 10-minute window? And more importantly, what's the one detail in this case that doesn't sit right with you? Drop your theory in the comments. I read every one of them. And if you're the kind of person who doesn't just watch these cases, but tries to understand them, make sure you subscribe. Because some stories don't end when the video does. They stay with you, and the next one might be even harder to explain